Thank you, Melinda, and good afternoon to everybody in The Hague. I'm very sorry I can't be there myself, but I really want to appreciate the opportunity to make a contribution to what I see as a very important, a very timely, and a very exciting discussion about what do we actually mean by sexual violence in conflict. Let me start by talking a bit about why I feel it's so important to have this Call It What It Is campaign. I think right from the beginning we have a problem with people, we find that problem where people do not name something, it gets disregarded. If it's not there in black and white, it hasn't happened. I think another big problem that we have is that, particularly when we're talking about sexual violence done to men, a lot of it gets described as torture, both by the victims themselves, but also by the organizations that are intervening in support of victims of torture. It's really time that we bring them out from underneath that umbrella. But I'm saying, just as if we talk about conflict, we don't necessarily know that torture took part of it, was a part of that conflict. Similarly, when we talk about torture, we don't know that sexual violence was necessarily a part of that. And it's important, therefore, that just as when we want to bring out the specifics of what was done during torture in conflict, we need to bring out the specifics of what was done as a form of sexual violence in torture. There are so many ways in which victims, survivors, those intervening in their favor end up being mutually silencing and compounding the silence. What we have also found as an organization working directly with survivors is that if we can name it and we can call it what it is, often that is very helpful to the survivor, because it takes the onus off her, off him, and we can just say, so did this particular form of sexual violence happen to you? And the only answer that the person has to give is yes or no. I want to speak briefly to some of the dangers of trying to call it what it is. And I think the very major one there is that if we try to codify it, we inevitably end up silencing something that we have not included under our codification. And linked to that, the more specific that we become, the more specific we have to get as we go along. What do I mean by that? I remember back in 2012 when I first met Patricia Sellers in a conference in Washington. I gave a presentation of the forms of sexual violence that we had seen at that point in terms of our male beneficiaries. And I think I had 12 items on my list. If I were to give that same list now, it would have at least 40 or 50 different forms that we have come across in the course of our work. What do I mean by getting more and more specific as you go along? I mean, say, okay, sexual violence was committed. What was the form? Were the genitals tied? Were you beaten? Oh, they were tied. How were they tied? Did somebody tie a weight to your testicles? Yes. Did they tie it to your testicles, or did they tie it to your penis? And so on and so on. The third issue I wanted to talk to is what are some of the challenges to calling it what it is. I think the one we all need to be very cognizant of is that even if we are able to generate a more comprehensive way of calling it what it is, will survivors, will victims be able to actually make use of it? I want to take the example of the definition of rape in the International Criminal Court, which is very comprehensive. It's a marvelous definition, great drafting, and it covers a whole range of different ways in which rape can be done. How many years are we after the drafting of the Rome Statute, and how many people actually have taken on board that much more comprehensive definition of rape with all that it entails? More fundamentally even than that, how we call it what it is and how we attempt to elaborate that is already being shaped by the way in which we call it what it is at the moment. When we go to the Rome Statute, and we say, okay, sexual violence, and we look at the elements of crime. And the first one is an act of a sexual nature. Now, anybody who's done battle with colonial definitions of same-sex sex will know that an act against the order of nature, which is how anal sex was described in those laws, is actually extremely difficult to pin down. And nature itself is such a hugely normative concept and phrase and word that we get into a lot of problems. We also have a problem that for those of us that are fortunate enough not to have been victims of sexual violence in conflict, we tend to read across from understandings of sexuality in peacetime. And that creates a lot of issues in terms of how we understand what happens in conflict and how we interpret. So that just the language of sexual nature, to me, is putting a lot of obstacles in the place of really calling it what it is. So if we do want to call it what it is, are there any alternatives? I would say that in addition to talking about acts of a sexual nature, and distinct from that, we need to talk about acts that target the victim's sexuality, their sexual identity, their sexual orientation. We also need to talk about acts that impact on their sexuality, on their sexual identity, on their sexual orientation. And why do I think it's important to have those three different ways of talking about sexual violence? Acts of a sexual nature, acts that impact on sexuality, acts that target sexuality. It's because they also entail different ways of looking at the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, the level of intention, and they don't fixate on intention. We do have acts that target. I think of, for example, salty water being put onto a man's genitals and then bringing a goat to lick the salt. That targets that man's sexuality in a very distinct way and with a clear intention. We can look at other acts that clearly have impacted on a person's sexuality in a very serious way, and I think particularly let us talk about the post-election violence in which men in Kenya were forcibly circumcised and sometimes ended up being castrated. That act impacted directly on their sexuality. Was that the intention of the perpetrators? Who knows? They would probably say, no, we were just, we were attacking them in terms of an ethnic marker, which was the foreskin or its absence. And yet, for the victims, are they more bothered by the ethnic considerations of the perpetrators or by the impact on their sexuality and their capacity to function sexually, to have relationships, to lead the life they expected to lead? In my view, there's no question that these were acts of sexual violence from a victim perspective, from a survivor perspective. And to call them anything other than acts of sexual violence is doing a huge disservice to them and a disservice to the pursuit of justice. I think I should end there, but I would just like to thank you again for the opportunity to make this input, and I look forward to watching the proceedings on video. Thank you very much.